am the director of the Bud Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Today is a day of celebration, both of Buddy and his commitment to the University of Florida and to the Center of Jewish Studies in particular. There are a number of festivities today, but we thought it would be a wonderful idea to have an academic panel on that subject, which is very close to Buddy's heart. That is the American Jewish experience. We have three panelists today, really wonderful up-and-coming scholars, which represent a very nice cross-section of the American Jewish experience. We'll hear about culture and indeed high culture. We'll hear about how American Jews after World War II were represented in popular culture, and we will also hear some new revelations about the somewhat complicated relationship between American Jews on the one hand and the new state of Israel on the other in the late 40s and 50s. Here's how it's going to go. I'm going to introduce our panelists all at once, and they will speak. And then we will have a question and answer period. Please keep in mind that we have refreshments after this event. They're upstairs, are they? Oh, they're right over there. We have refreshments after this event. And we also have a table over there which will acquaint you with some of our swag, but also some of the center's courses and the kinds of things we are interested in. But first, our panel and our panelist. Our first speaker will be Dr. Samantha M. Cooper. She is the Ariel and Joshua Weiner Family Fellow at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a historical musicologist who specializes in American Jewish cultural history, and she is also the producer and host of the Sounding Jewish podcast, which I highly recommend. The title of her talk today is The Undesirable in Box 14, The Untold History of American Jewish Men and the Metropolitan Opera House, 1880 to 1940. Our second speaker is Dr. Geoffrey Levin, who is an assistant professor of Middle Eastern and Jewish Studies at Emory University, where he teaches courses on Israel, the Middle East, and American Jewish history. His first book, Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Dissent, will be published by Yale University Press very soon in November 2023. And finally, our last speaker, I am proud to say, is our own Dr. Rachel Gordan, who is the Bud Shorstein Fellow in American Jewish Culture and Society here at the University of Florida, where she teaches in the Bud Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies and in the Department of Religion. Her book, which recently won a new author's award from the Association for Jewish Studies, will be published this spring with Oxford University Press, and its title is Post-War Stories, How Books Made Judaism American. And the title of her talk is Life Magazine's Post-War American Judaism. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Dr. Samantha Cooper.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Let's get started. Perfect. Financier and philanthropist Otto Hermann Kahn spent 28 years as a chairman, managing director, and stockholder of the Metropolitan Opera Company. Between his voluntary appointment to this board in 1903 and his resignation in 1931, Kahn liaised with assorted opera house staff, handled the opera company's colorful clashes with the building owners, and suggested new repertoire and talent. He frequently hosted opera company board meetings in the offices of the bank where he was a partner, Kuhnloeb and Company. In April 1910, Kahn arranged to buy out the Met's staunchest competitor, Oscar Hammerstein I, from the local opera business. 10 years later, he attempted and ultimately failed to gift the Metropolitan Opera and Real Estate Company, which from now on I'll just call the Morico, a $1 million plot of land for the building of a new, more democratic opera house. Kahn, who gradually accrued ownership of 84% of the opera company's stock, demonstrated what historian Valerie Paley has labeled a boundless commitment to the Metropolitan Opera House. Yet he remained ineligible to purchase an opera box of his own from the Morico until 1917 because he was Jewish. Instead, Kahn would watch operas from seats he had purchased in a rented parterre box, the director's box, or an orchestra stall, as the Morico and their guests looked down on him from above. However, neither Kahn's devotion to the opera house nor his experiences with social prejudice therein were unique. Rather, I assert, he was only one of a number of Jewish men who became fixtures of labor, voluntarism, and patronage at all levels of the organization for at least the first 6 decades of its existence, in spite of the fact that Jews and other ethnic, racial, and religious minorities were subject to inferior social status at the institution. Susanna Heschel is one of several Jewish historians to point to the methodology of counterhistory as useful for the formulation of radical challenges to hegemonic forms of knowledge. Multiculturally informed counterhistories, she suggests, have the ability to give voice to neglected groups within history, to develop new analytical tools to better understand the position of the socially marginal, and to expose how power is exercised within the mainstream academy. Heschel observes that retelling stories of Christian origin from a Jewish perspective has historically served as an act of Jewish self-empowerment, as it demonstrates a Jewish desire to enter the Christian myth, become its hero, and claim the power inherent in it, by flipping the object and subject of the gaze to transform Jews into the subjects of their own self-defined historical narratives. Following Heschel's call for seizing the inherent potential of treating Jewish history as counterhistory, this paper counterhistoricizes the Met's founding and first 60 years from a Jewish orientation. As part of reframing the Met's history as a Jewish history, I find 2 seemingly contradictory realities to be true. Truth number 1. The opera house relied on Jewish men to function and thrive. Their ongoing labor and financial contributions to the Met made it possible for the Jewish community to host over 70 in-group events and activities at the Opera House between 1880 and 1940. Through this mutually beneficial work and play relationship, these men transformed the Opera House into an example of what Jewish historians Julia Brauch, Anna Liphart, and Alexandra Nock call a lived Jewish space. And truth number 2. At the same time, Jewish men constantly negotiated the limits of their relationship to the Met, within a hostile climate of anti-Semitism. An examination of the Met's policies, correspondence between the founders and non-Jewish participants, press coverage, and memoirs by those present manifest a fraught atmosphere of xenophobia towards Jews. Amidst these 2 realities, Jewish laborers, philanthropists, and other contributors confronted in stark terms what it meant to devote themselves to the propagation of a musical culture and an institution that no matter what they had to offer, would not and could not love them back. The Met's customary origin story is by design not a very Jewish one. The institution was raised to satisfy the needs of an affronted clan of newly rich industrial and mercantile families who were unable to acquire opera boxes through the closed inheritance-based transfer system at the local Academy of Music at 14th Street and Irving Place. In April 1880, the mostly male members of these families decided that they would open a local opera house of their own on Broadway between 39th and 40th Streets. They established the Metropolitan Opera Company Limited. And evidently absent from this version of the white, heteronormative, Christian, English-speaking, American-born narrative is attention to the key players who incentivized the founders to establish the new opera house. So, what would a Jewish take on this story look like? Well, the directors of the Academy of Music, who had so offended the founders with his inability to offer them opera boxes at his venue, was none other than August Belmont Sr., a non-practicing, Prussian-born Jew who had changed his name from the distinctive Germanic Schönberg to the French-inflected Belmont, while keeping the same meaning of beautiful mountain upon his arrival in the United States. Belmont, meanwhile, relied on a network of Jewish impresarios, talent, and patrons to keep his Academy of Music afloat during his 1878 to 1884 appointment, including Moravian Jewish impresarios Bernard Ullmann, Max Moretzek, Maurice Strakosch, and Jacob Grau, performers like the Jewish Sigmund Thalberg, Selina Dolero, and Berta Morena, and Jewish audience members and patrons, like Forward newspaper founder Abraham Kahan, who memorialized his many trips to the Academy in his memoir. Meanwhile, Belmont's Academy of Music consistently played annual host to the Jewish community's events, such as the annual Purim Association of New York's Ball, dating back to the 1860s. It is not inconceivable, then, that the Met's founders characterized Belmont's refusal of admittance to the Academy of Music as a rejection by Jews. The future of the Morocco may have been established as the new opera house in part in a reactionary backlash, and they carried this resentment forward into the social climate of the new Met. And yet, even as the Morocco was eager to throw open the doors of their new opera house and welcome a high society clientele, they still required builders to raise the Met and laborers to make the arrangements for opera. This time, one of the answers to both of their problems, rather than the cause of their upset, was New York's Jewish population. While the architect hired to design the Met was American Presbyterian Cleveland J. Caddy, the builders who actualized Caddy's design worked for Mark Eidlitz and Son, an architectural firm founded by Bohemian Jewish immigrant Mark Eidlitz. Though usually relegated to the periphery of the Met's history, a lengthy list of men of Jewish ancestry can be found in the arsenals of the Opera House's workforce, ensuring the daily operations. Beginning in the Met's first season, Bavarian-born father and immigrant son Wolf and Henry Dazian served as the Met's first costume designers until 1892. Max Hirsch worked as treasurer and manager of the Met's box office until 1910. And Moravian-born impresario Maurice Grau, the most active third of the Abby Schiffel-Grau managerial triumvirate, assumed responsibility for the opera company in 1883 and 1884, and then again after Jewish impresarios Leopold and Walter Damrosch's tenures, this time with the support of a largely Jewish board. After Grau and the Damrosches came Heinrich Conried, before Giulio Gatti-Casazza was hired to put an end to this era of almost exclusively German Jewish leadership. Musicologist Davide Seriani cites Gatti-Casazza as having written in a letter in 1923 that he knew he had arrived at the Metropolitan Opera House to break off a German Jewish tradition and establish a Christian Italian one. Beyond the impresarios and their opera company boards, a number of the Met's lawyers, instrumentalists, conductors, vocalists, scenic painters, and artist managers in the company's first 60 years were Jewish. To give an amusing example of just how Jewish the Met's local business ties were, we need look no further than Saul Bloom, the owner of the music store beside the Met. He crops up in the Met's meeting minutes in 1913 with a politely phrased decision that the Morocco would permit Bloom to change the name of his store from Saul Bloom and Company to the Opera Shop. I think they hoped that he would stop marketing his business with advertisements bearing the language Saul Bloom and Son and the Metropolitan Opera House, now under one roof. However, just because the Met needed its Jewish men does not mean that this increased the Morocco's regard for them. While some undoubtedly enjoyed unremarkable careers at the Opera House, others faced ongoing hurdles, amplified in the press and fostered by the Morocco. Though the Morocco generally seemed to like Maurice Grau, he was frequently the beneficiary of backhanded compliments in the press, which praised him for his keen business acumen in spite of his lamented lack of musical talent. Conried, one of the few Jewish men described by his biographer Montrose J. Moses as observant of Jewish tradition, was by far the least liked. He often made managerial decisions that ran contra to Christian logic and baffled the Morocco, as when he initially contemplated approaching an all-Jewish group of men to serve on his board of directors. He was dissuaded from doing so by his friend and fellow Jew, Henry Morgenthau. And there's this great quote of what Morgenthau said to Conried, which was essentially that you'll have a great wine list with that list of Jewish men, but not such a great opera board. You'd never secure the opera house through it. And then again, when Conried scheduled the premiere of Parsifal without Wagner's widow's permission on Christmas Eve of 1904, and when he staged the dress rehearsal of Salome, immediately following Sunday morning church services in January 1907. In response to this final tactless act, Morocco board member Robert Goulet labeled Conried's actions a demonstration of his curious disregard for convention. As fellow Morocco director Elliot Gregory observed, the Met real estate gentleman seemed to hate him, Conried. And at the culmination of Conried's tenure, in spite of the success of convert conductor Gustav Mahler at the Met beginning in 1908, the Morocco terminated a proposal to bring him to the Opera House full-time because, as coded correspondence between Gregory and fellow board member James Hazen Hyde put it, Mahler is a J. Regrettably, other problematic examples in this vein do abound. Returning to Kahn, we find that his disqualification from purchasing an opera box did not derive, as historians John Kobler, Stephen Birmingham, and Johanna Fiedler have maintained, from an unwritten ordinance that no Jewish person, whatever their level of wealth or position within the Met, could purchase an opera box. Rather, Kahn's exclusion was carefully codified by the Morocco's board of directors. Having built the Met chiefly with the objective of claiming one of 122 gilded opera boxes, the founders carefully restricted the succession of these commodities. A particular passage from their meeting minutes of March 21st, 1900, delimits eligibility to purchase stock or opera boxes, and they state, "The bylaws of the company further provide that no persons can become stockholders unless previously approved by the directors. And it is deemed by the subscribers to be equally important that all persons occupying boxes under lease should also be selected with care and discrimination. For the reason that the character of the occupants of the boxes has great influence on the value of the house and its attraction to the general audience, and that in case such boxes should fall into the hands of undesirable persons, the value of the property of all the stockholders would be seriously affected. Though Jews are not specifically mentioned in this clause, the founders fear that their coveted opera boxes would fall into the hands of undesirable persons, smacks of language widely used to refer to Jewish immigrants of the era." When the Morocco eventually relented and extended Kahn the privilege of opera box ownership, they did not do so because of any embarrassment over the fact that they had long neglected this dedicated colleague on the basis of his religion. Rather, their board meeting minutes reveal that giving Kahn the newly available Opera Box 14 was preferable to allowing it to fall into the hands of someone with whom they lacked any real familial or social acquaintance. With or without an assigned opera box, Kahn continued to purchase his opera seats outright, and his correspondence reveals that he gifted or lent his opera box to visitors whenever the opportunity arose. He had no interest in being the Morocco's token Jew. And yet, at the same time as these illustrations of anti-Jewish sentiment unfolded, the Met also provided a valuable home for the Jewish community's events. Between 1880 and 1940, thank you. Thanks so much. Wealthy Jews played host, beneficiary, or featured performer in over 70 events at the Met. The diverse fraternal and mixed-gender community gatherings for which they commandeered the Opera House ranged in purpose and scope, from organizational fundraisers and charity balls to Jewish weddings, birthdays, funerals, Purim and Hanukkah holiday celebrations, anniversaries, cantorial performances, concerts, club meetings, Zionist conventions, and honorary dinners. Immediately after the Met's founding, the Purim Association of New York moved their annual event from the Academy of Music to the new Opera House. By bringing in Jewish people, values, causes, symbols, life cycle events, and sometimes even kosher food, they transformed the Met into a lived Jewish space. Lived Jewish spaces are spatial environments in which Jewish things happen, where Jewish activities are performed and which in turn are shaped and defined by those Jewish activities. Unlike exclusively Jewish venues like synagogues, private homes, kosher restaurants, Jewish-owned hotels, settlement houses, or Yiddish theaters, the secular Met carried a certain clout that appealed to this minority group looking to gain toleration in society at large and in the space itself. A final note, Jewish men affiliated with the institution clearly used their positions of privilege to help Jewish community organizations and individuals secure space and employment at the Opera House. For example, the advertisement displayed thanks Grau for directing an opera for a Jewish charity event, while an article from another Jewish paper expresses gratitude to Conried for making it possible for Jewish children from the Hebrew Orphan Asylum to attend an opera. Kahn, too, used his authority to ensure that Jewish artists received an opportunity to work at the Met. A correspondence from January 29, 1918, between Kahn and Gatti Casazza reveals that scenic designer Boris Annisfeld received the opportunity to work for the Met because Kahn told Gatti Casazza that he would, quote, be glad if you will give him, Annisfeld, the opportunity to show you some of his sketches and paintings. Kahn further expressed his hope that Gatti Casazza would, quote, consistently see a way to employ Annisfeld in connections with productions at the Metropolitan Opera House, because I, Kahn, as well as valued friends of mine, would greatly appreciate it. If the bulwark of the American empire of opera was the Met, then Jewish men at once constituted officers for and vassals to this empire. Depending on the specific historical circumstances facing the institution, Jews served simultaneously as enforcers and victims of problematic segregationist policies. They experienced a dually rewarding and tumultuous relationship with the Opera House and its founders, and they were aware of their convoluted institutional status. Put simply, Jewish men were a tolerated group at the Met, viewed sometimes with hostility and other times with indifference by the Morocco. To tell an accurate and comprehensive story of the Met, I contend, requires a full consideration of the treatment of the tolerated internal minorities that kept it in operation. Attending to the oppositional structures that conditioned these Jewish men's experiences as undesirables on the one hand, and I propose essentials on the other, can help us to better understand the fraught nature of minoritarian interactions with American cultural institutions. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Mr. Shorstein, and all of the supporters of the center for making this event possible. And of course, thank you everyone for coming. So I'm going to take you from this wonderful sunny day in Florida to a day with a bit less good weather in the Middle East, not in Israel, but in neighboring Lebanon. On a cold and rainy November day, a 65-year-old American rabbi trudged down the muddy roads of Shatila, a Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut. When he and his colleagues stopped, refugees gathered around them in a scene of, quote, disappointment, frustration, and despair, the rabbi later recalled. Gaunt men and, quote, children big-eyed and thin walked up and clutched the rabbi's raincoat. Several refugees began chanting in Arabic, "We want to go home." Others just watched the rabbi silently in their cold tents. The rabbi felt guilty. In my deepest heart, I said the prayer of confession, the rabbi wrote, "Anachnu chatanu," we have sinned. This rabbi's visit didn't occur recently, nor did his trip take place any time after the infamous 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre. Rather, it was 1953 when Rabbi Morris Lazarin walked through the Shatila refugee camp, an experience which led him to call for Israel to recognize the right of return for Arab refugees who had left during the war 5 years prior. While Morris Lazaron is long forgotten, he was not an obscure figure in his prime. Born in Savannah, in my current home state, only a 3 or 4 hour drive from here, to a deeply Americanized Sephardic family, Lazaron led one of the most prominent Reformed congregations in Baltimore, the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, and had been the brother-in-law to Zionist leader Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver. But by the time of his 1953 visit, he was estranged from both, then serving as vice president of the controversial anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism, and as a writer for the anti-Zionist Jewish newsletter. But the real twist here isn't just that Lazaron's lament took place so early in Israel's history. It's who funded his trip. Lazaron's 1953 trip to the Middle East and his book about the visit were both funded by a group called the American Friends of the Middle East, which represented itself as a concerned citizens group, but was actually a CIA front group. Its secret founder was this man, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., best known as grandson of former President Theodore Roosevelt, who's also, Kermit being also well known for his key role in the 1953 CIA coup in Iran. But his other main accomplishment of the 1950s was setting up this group, American Friends of the Middle East, AFME, which aimed to push American public discourse in a pro-Arab direction in order to allow the Eisenhower administration to make it easier for the Eisenhower administration to pressure Israel. Supporting and publicizing the activities of anti-Zionist Jews like Lazaron was only one subset of AFME's broader public relations activities, which was funneled through primarily CIA money through a secret foundation called the Dearborn Foundation. Yet American officials weren't the only government actors to be closely engaged with early American Jewish political rights advocacy. So too were Arabs and Israeli diplomats, who each played a role in fomenting and limiting such advocacy. That brings us to the main points of my research, which I'm here to talk about today. So two main points in my forthcoming book, which is coming out in November. One is that, we have this idea that sort of American engagement, involvement, and knowledge about the Palestinians is something recent, and I show no, this is actually something that goes back to Israel's creation in 1948. And B, as you saw from my little pivot there, this engagement has always been very deeply entangled with the actions of a variety of government actors, including the United States, as well as Israel and the Arab world. So I'll give just a couple examples. I have this whole book and I have about 14 more minutes. So feel free to ask some questions about these little vignettes. One sector of this activism came through anti-Zionist Jews. These anti-Zionist Jews of the 40s and 50s weren't anti-Zionist because of a particular concern about the Middle East. They resisted Jewish nationalism. They felt that Jews were a religion. They thought that supporting Israel would make their own loyalty to the US something questionable. So this American Council for Judaism even uses the term Judaism to de-emphasize the Jewish aspect of one's identity. So this group, here pictured in the middle, Lessing Rosenwald, whose family owned Sears Roebuck, who was the president of the organization, and sitting down on the higher side, Rabbi Elmer Berger, the executive director. And to give you an example of how entangled these were with other state actors, here's the board of directors of the American Friends of the Middle East. And you can see Elmer Berger, the director of the council, is also on the board. He's actually was a big player even in creating some of these connections and funding routes. So you can see here his book, Who Knows Better Must Say So, is funded by American Friends of the Middle East, as is the book that I quoted from, Rabbi Lazaron's record of his trip, in which he was very critical of Israeli policy. my book isn't all about the CIA. More of it is actually about Middle Eastern actors. Berger was inspired to become not just a critic of Zionism, but a Palestinian rights activist through his engagement with Arab League representatives, like the man pictured here, Faiz Saig, who ran the Arab League's information efforts in the 50s. You can see here Rabbi Berger in the West Bank in the Jerusalem airport in 1959, again, being inspired and connected by Saig and others. On the other end, his organization was both courted and pressured by Israeli officials. The president and other leading, more moderate figures in the anti-Zionist group were courted by figures like Teddy Kollek, later became mayor of Jerusalem, while some of his associates faced some sort of negative covert activity from future Israeli ambassador Abe Harman on the other side. But these various efforts to sort of peel off the moderates made some progress when, after several meetings between the anti-Zionist group chairman Lessing Rosenwald and the Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion, led him to really moderate his views. And ultimately, Rosenwald played a key role in pushing Berger, the more radical pro-Palestine rabbi, out of the organization a number of years later. And of course, after being relieved of the position, Rabbi Elmer Berger retired to Florida. Anyway, my point is not just that anti-Zionist Jews are involved in these questions back then, not just the radicals, but also mainstream voices like the American Jewish Committee, AJC. If anyone knows anything about American Jewish politics, you've heard of the AJC, the oldest existing American Jewish advocacy organization, founded in 1906 by people like Lewis Marshall, featured here, people in New York fighting anti-Semitism at home, supporting Russian Jews who faced pogroms at the time. And they're really focused on global Jewish advocacy increasingly after World War II. And they consider themselves non-Zionist. So they don't really oppose Zionists, but they're also not comfortable with the idea that Jews are a nation. At the time, they feel more comfortable saying America's our nation, and we have a connection with these Jews over there, but we're not, we don't sign on to everything Zionism says. So they're feeling really awkward when Israel's created. They kind of weren't really a big supporter of it. Eventually, they come on board, and they have all these committees to talk about their concerns. They renamed one, the Committee on Impact of Israel on American Jews, to their Israel Committee, and again, mixed feelings. What do we say about this? What do we say about that? And one of the issues that they're debating is the question of the Palestinian refugees. So 1948 war happens, Israel's created, and around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs lose their homes, many ending up in other countries. Israel, for reasons we can discuss later, doesn't want them to come back in, and the AJC is arguing different things at home. They want Jewish refugees to be able to come to the U.S. They're arguing things about America being not a nation for one religion. So they're feeling awkward about some of these things and not really adjusting immediately to what we consider Israel's sort of role in American Jewish life. So they want to do something in part because Christian groups are looking at them and wondering what they're going to do about this Palestinian issue. And so they hire the sort of leading expert at the time, a scholar in his 30s, American Jewish person of actually Sephardic Jerusalem ancestry, who had volunteered to help displaced Arabs in 48, who wrote the first book on the topic. And they hire him to create this philanthropic project to help displaced Arabs. And it gets announced, and Israeli diplomats are really, really unhappy with it, and they basically tell the leadership of the AJC, we don't want anyone talking about this, just put this aside. Maybe you should let this guy go. We don't really like this Don Peretz guy, and they don't listen to that, but they decide, let's not, this is sensitive, let's not touch it. So that kind of disappears. But another lingering issue is the status of the people who became Arab citizens of Israel. And they become citizens several years after Israel was created, but most of them are living in territories that are under military control. So we're not talking about the West Bank, we're talking about parts of Israel proper, and they're facing limitations on movement and whatnot. The AJC leadership feels a need to bring this up when they meet with the Prime Minister in 1957. And they want to push Israel to change its policies toward its Arab citizens. Why are they doing this in a meeting with the Prime Minister? Well, there's a few reasons. One is that they're calling themselves a human rights group. So, people like parrots, people like government officials are saying you need to be consistent. So that's one reason. Another is because they're concerned about Israel, even if they don't use the Zionist label for themselves. And three is, again, talking about the role of state actors, fear about Arab propaganda around this issue and anti-Semitism. Because the feeling of the AJC at the time is anything that makes Jews look bad is bad for American Jews. That anti-Semitic groups on the far right will take advantage of pamphlets issued by Arab state diplomats, and they really bring this up as a problem to the Israeli Prime Minister when they visit in 57. They go around, they visit Arab towns and villages, they spend days investigating this themselves, and they, in their own kind of stilted way, bring this up and kind of press Ben-Gurion to rethink Israel's approach to its Arab minority. Really intriguingly is they're not sure because they don't consider themselves Israelis, they're not officially Zionist, what right they have to point out these issues. And they soften the blow on Ben-Gurion by saying, what we did with the Japanese Americans during World War II was just as bad, or worse. So they're very sort of gentle in this, especially the president of the AJC at the time, Irving Engel, who a lot of Southern Jews in this program. He's from Alabama originally, so the conversation isn't super productive in that realm. Following up from this, another leading official of the AJC, the son of its sort of earlier president, Louis Marshall, James Marshall, writes a 20-page pamphlet. He'd been to Israel a number of times. He is involved in the UN, generally a prominent attorney based in New York, sends this 20-page pamphlet to the Israeli officials saying, you could open up the union to Arabs, you could have more sort of sitting down, talking down methods, you could look at what the civil rights groups are doing in the US to make changes. And it comes off, at least to my eyes, as a very sort of thoughtful, not critical, but in a productive type of way. I put some of his recommendations here: expanding Arabic study, liberalizing permit systems, nothing super radical, one might think. But the sort of response that he gets from the Prime Minister's office is, your trip was short, you don't really know what you're talking about. And that's sort of the attitude. And whether it's coming from someone like Marshall, who's prominent and is engaged, or someone like Peretz, who's super engaged. He's the only American Jew to volunteer with Arab refugees. He spent 2 years at Hebrew University. He wrote the first book on the Palestinian refugee issue, pictured here. And speaking of the book, Israeli diplomats are really unhappy with it, including a diplomat named Yaakov Morris, whose son Benny would write a much more controversial book on this topic 3 decades later. And so with more and more nudging in 1958, Don Peretz is sort of pushed out of the AJC. So, the anti-Zionists had a position on this issue. The non-Zionists had a position on this issue. But for a variety of reasons, the politics of Israel continue to change. American Jews in these circles, the non-Zionist, anti-Zionist circles, are not sure how they totally feel about Israel. But in years that follow these episodes, Israel becomes a lot more ingrained in American life and American Jewish life. because of culture. We have two great cultural history scholars who don't cover this, but are aware of the cultural impact of Exodus and raising American Jewish pride for Israel, love for Israel, sort of an unwillingness to maybe criticize it too publicly, and the sort of increasing pride that comes of the drama of the 1967 war, which later brings out new issues with Israeli policy and American Jewish debates about it that I deal with at the last chapter of my book. I end in 1978. So, but the 50s is, I think, a really intriguing time for me, as I showed today. So my book ends in 78, but as you know, these sort of debates continue, and not just about the Palestinian issue, but I think I copy-pasted here from an article a few days ago. I'm not here to talk about the present, but I just want to say these same sort of questions. What can American Jews say about Israel? How do we, contribute in a productive way, and sort of so forth, are maybe even more relevant today than they were in the 50s. But certainly conversations about that topic can inform today's debate in some way or another. So still another 3 months, but here's sort of a sneak peek of the book, and I'm so happy to be able to present that to all of you. So thank you again.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, many of us were talking about this. This is the prosthetic nose that actor Bradley Cooper wears to play Leonard Bernstein in Maestro, the biographical film about the conductor that was just unveiled at the Venice Film Festival this past week, and which will be available on Netflix in December. As many culture critics noted, people had big feelings about Bradley Cooper's fake big nose. It was considered too distracting, too different from Bernstein's actual nose. And of course, people wondered if maybe there wasn't something a little anti-Semitic about this imitation of a Jewish nose by a non-Jewish actor. Even though Bernstein's children released the statement that many of us read in the newspapers, they said, quote, "It happens to be true that Leonard Bernstein had a nice big nose. Bradley chose to use makeup to amplify his resemblance, and we're perfectly fine with that." Even for those of us who did not find this nose portrayal problematic or anti-Semitic, the feelings brought up by it are the anxious feelings about representation of minority groups in popular culture, which are not new and have by now become familiar to many of us. These are the feelings of, what will people think? How is this making Jews look? What were the intentions behind this portrayal? I want to give these feelings some historical context by looking back to a 1955 special issue of Life magazine about Judaism. For this issue, Life was in search of a Jewish family to profile. When word reached Victor Geller, the dean of Yeshiva University's Community Service Division, that Life was looking for a family, Geller met with one of Life's photographers, Cornel Kappa, the younger brother of war photographer Robert Kappa. Kappa told Geller about Life's stipulations for the kind of Jewish family the magazine hoped to feature. The family should have 3 generations in reasonably good health, Kappa told him. They should have an upcoming special event, such as a bar mitzvah or a wedding, that Life could photograph. And the family should be economically comfortable. Kappa told Geller, quote, "It cannot be poor. This is important because we want the pictures to tell a positive story. Poverty can't be hidden from the camera. It makes even the sunniest picture a little gray." Life's concern to portray Orthodox Jews as financially comfortable was less a desire to capture Orthodox Jews as they really were than it was a plan to show Jews as middle class, a sign of Orthodoxy's integration into mainstream white middle class American society. As Kappa spoke about life's requirements for the kind of Jewish family they were seeking, Geller had an idea. Some years earlier, he had worked with a Jewish family named Fink, helping them to revive their local Orthodox congregation. They were economically comfortable, and there were even 3 generations of the Fink family living in Scranton, Pennsylvania. There was only one problem with the Finks as a potential family to profile. When Victor Geller telephoned them requesting their participation in the life story, their first response was no. In his telephone conversation with David and his wife, Toby Fink, Geller went into pitch mode. He later wrote that he told them, quote, "I am not conferring an honor upon you. I am asking you to consider a special responsibility. There exists here an opportunity for a rare Kiddush Hashem, meaning sanctification of God's name. You and your family have been in the forefront of the effort to revitalize Orthodox Judaism in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The stereotypical picture of the impoverished ghetto-dwelling Jew left behind by progress to weave nostalgic dreams of a romanticized shtetl is still all too common even today. By calling the life story an opportunity to honor God, Geller reminded the Finks that public relations were vital to Orthodox Judaism in 1950s America. If Jews like David and Toby Fink wanted a future for Orthodoxy, Geller explained, they had to fight for it, and they had to promote it through their own story. The Finks accepted. The cover of the June 13th issue showed a photograph of Mrs. Toby Fink of Scranton, Pennsylvania, with her hands above Sabbath candles. The caption read, "Scranton Mother Blesses Sabbath Lights." Her dark hair pulled back in a kerchief, Toby Fink wore a long-sleeve embroidered peasant blouse and skirt. It was a very different look from that of the suburban mothers depicted in popular 1950s television shows, such as The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, and I Love Lucy, and an even farther cry from a woman just 3 years younger than Toby Fink, Marilyn Monroe. Monroe's 1955 film, The 7-Year Itch, had just premiered in early June of 1955. With its famous shot of Monroe standing on a subway grate as her white dress blew upward, it turned what once would have seemed an immodest and embarrassing moment into one that viewers instantly recognized as sexy and fun. Norms were changing, and images of women in a range of middle-brow media, including TV, movies, and photojournalism, played a powerful role in influencing ideas about sex and gender. Marilyn Monroe's image showed the post-war shift in attitudes towards sex, while Toby Fink's life image suggested a backward glance and a vision of a plainer America with religion at its core. That the 1950s contained both cultural impulses, an openness toward sexual fun and old-fashioned religion, is a reminder of the complexity of all eras, as well as the specifically contradictory 1950s images of female gender norms. In previous months, Life's cover women included Princess Margaret, actress Shelley Winters, her wrists dripping with diamonds but otherwise naked in a bubble bath, and the cool, elegant beauty of Grace Kelly, winner of the 1955 Academy Award for Best Actress. To some readers accustomed to these other kinds of life images, the Toby Fink cover was the first sign that in this issue, Life magazine had chosen to render Jews quaint and exotic. Quote, "Why is Henry Luce so anxious to make people think that a Jewish woman looks like something in a Turkish harem?" This was what a Jewish television network official asked a rabbi friend upon seeing the June 13th issue. The rabbi Samuel Silver, who served as director of public relations at the Reform Movement's Union of American Hebrew Congregations, then wrote to Josepha Stewart, who wrote most of the Life article. Rabbi Silver went beyond simply critiquing the cover image, explaining to Stewart in his letter that although, quote, the writing is excellent, especially the description of the function of the prophets, the role of the Talmud, the Jewish belief in free will, etc., the problem was in how Life chose to depict Jews in its photographs. Life was primarily a picture magazine, quote, and the illustrations and some of the captions are, as I feared, in the loose tradition of picturing the Jew as quaint. And Rabbi Silver here is referring to Henry Luce, the publisher of Time Incorporated. Rabbi Silver elaborated on the specifics of how Life had offended American Jews by selecting images from outside the mainstream. Quote, the truth of the matter is that in real life, only a very small minority of Jews look like Life's Jews. Beardlessness is true not only of Reform Jews and laymen, but of conservative laymen and rabbis, and of the vast majority of Orthodox laymen and a majority of Orthodox rabbis. You would never know that if you received your impressions from Life Spread. As Silver's letter suggested, a mainstream middle-brow publication like Life magazine had the potential to reassure members of a minority religious group when it reflected back a vision of those readers as accepted in American society. But the magazine could also disrupt a group's positive self-image. Silver's letter revealed his frustration with his own emotional response to Life's photos as he launched into a defensive sermon on Jews and beards. Quote, I hope you do not construe these remarks as indicating a personal dislike for beards. I cherish Jews who wear them. My grandfather did. Nor do I feel that a magazine should not publish photos of bearded Jews. Nor do I feel troubled when I see such a photo, for I admire Jews who wear them as a badge, as it were, of their traditionalism. Notwithstanding Silver's protestations of affection for Jews with beards, the images clearly touched a nerve. The photos likely caused Rabbi Silver additional distress for what felt like shame at the depiction of the traditional Jews, the kind of Jews associated with those who had recently perished in the Holocaust. In his letter to Life, Silver rationalized his response to the images of old-fashioned Jews, explaining that the magazine's portrayal of such religious Jews was poor journalism, a distortion of the American Jewish scene. Rabbi Silver explained that it was, quote, like an essay on Protestantism featuring the Amish. To Silver, it seemed that Life deliberately sought an exotic, colorful version of Judaism for its photographic treatment. But many Jewish readers looked to the pages of Life hoping to find confirmation of their perceived normalcy as Americans. In the case of the June 13th special issue, some of these Jews were disappointed and perhaps a bit discombobulated, as Silver was, by their own reactions. The Life article followed the Fink family through a range of Jewish rituals and customs that would not have been typical of most suburban middle-class Jewish families. A photo showed the father, David Fink, teaching his son how to put on tefillin. We see that in the center, with the black leather straps wound around their arms and the small black box of the tefillin atop Mr. Fink's forehead. It was an image of Jewish religious practice that would have appeared unfamiliar and strange to non-Jewish readers, and as Silver's letter suggested, it was a daily religious practice atypical of non-Orthodox Jews. Another photo, captioned "In Kosher Kitchen," showed Mrs. Fink and her daughter Shirley stacking dishes, quote, making sure as dietary law requires that none used for meat touch any used for dairy foods. Dishpans in the photo were labeled meat and milk for the, quote, non-Jewish help employed by family, a clue that the family was indeed middle class. The article also included photographs from Mr. Fink's brother's Orthodox wedding. an image of the groom lifting his bride's veil, a custom that was, quote, supposed to assure him that the bride is the girl who was promised to him, likely seemed biblical. These photos also included a surfeit of bearded Jews. In his letter to the article's author, Josephus Stewart, Rabbi Silver effectively accused Life of having intentionally chosen a Jewish family that was exotic rather than typical. Quote, "You yourself know, Joe, how atypical even your Scranton family is," Silver wrote, detailing what was so unusual about the Fink family. Quote, "The family with the grandfather who pulls his shawl over his head, with the children eating with hats, with the veil lifting to make sure the right bride is below, with the boy learning to put on tefillin, with the bearded rabbi and contract signers. You know how atypical the family is because you had such a hard time finding it. Did not the rarity of this type of family actuate you to report to your editors that there would be something unrepresentative about devoting so much space to them?" Although Silver was angered by the exoticization of Judaism in Life, his letter suggested that he knew, that Life knew, that American Jews were more, quote, normal than the magazine had portrayed them, and that the magazine had gone out of its way to find Jews outside the Reform and conservative mainstream. Rabbi Silver's letter inadvertently revealed that Jews had indeed become more like other Americans, so much so that Life had to rely on extreme examples to create a, quote, colorful display. At least to some Reform Jews, and Rabbi Silver was not the only one to write into the magazine with these kind of complaints, the Life special issue had felt offensive. Did Orthodox Jews share those feelings about Life's treatment of Judaism? There is some evidence that more religious Jews viewed the magazine's portrayal from a very different angle. In their minds, there was a need for images for more religious Jews in popular culture. That was the feeling of the Fink family as the story was transmitted down the generations. Life was delighted to find 3 generations of a Jewish farming family. Quote, "They were ecstatic," Moshe Fink, one of David Fink's sons, recalled to me of Life's reaction at hearing about his father's work on the family's poultry farm. Moshe and his brothers continue to run that family poultry farm in Scranton, Pennsylvania today. At the time of the 1955 special issue, Moshe's oldest brother was almost 13 years old and about to have a bar mitzvah, and David's brother was about to be married. Both celebrations would become part of the Life article. But the family member who became most famous as a result of the Life treatment was Moshe's mother, Toby Fink. Reciting the Sabbath blessings over the lighted Sabbath candles and wearing an Israeli blouse embroidered by a Yemenite woman, Toby Fink's was the first image that readers saw when they received the magazine. Much could be written about that embroidered Yemenite blouse gifted to an Ashkenazic American woman that became the image of Orthodox Judaism to millions of Life readers. Through the magazine, Mizrahi Jewish culture inadvertently became part of the aesthetic portrayal of American Judaism, even as Mizrahi Judaism remained marginal to Eastern European Jewish culture and religion. Some 30 years after the Life article, Moshe Fink unexpectedly came face to face with the Life image of his mother. He was picking up his wife from a Brooklyn shop that styled Orthodox women's wigs. Moshe's wife, Etty, had telephoned him to pick her up and asked him to come inside the shop. The woman who was styling her wig wanted to meet Moshe. She had heard the family name and immediately asked Etty if it was the same Fink family from the 1955 Life issue. When David met her that day in the shop, she still had a copy of the 1955 Life magazine. The woman had saved the magazine, she told David Fink, because that June 13th, 1955 issue of Life, she said, had saved her. The woman, she said, had survived the concentration camps in Europe, only to return to Poland to find herself unwelcome. Stones were thrown at her. In post-war Poland, she felt that dogs were shown more sympathy and affection than Jews. Convinced that the life of a Jew was worthless in Poland, she immigrated to New York. Having shaved heads in the concentration camp, she declared herself a hairdresser, but her life was without meaning, she later told him. Quote, I existed, she said years later. She put food in her mouth, went to work, came home, but it wasn't a real life. Like the other hairdressers, she read Life magazine to stay current on the hairstyles. And then one day, she saw the June 13th, 1955 issue. It changed everything, she told Moshe. To see a Jewish lady lighting candles on the cover, it meant that a Jewish life was worth something in America. Even more stunning, it meant that the life of a Jewish woman mattered. It is not difficult to imagine how empowering it felt for countless Jewish women to see that image of someone like themselves on the cover of such a popular magazine. The woman in the wig shop had saved her copy of the magazine for decades. It would always sound corny in the retelling, but life had given her life again. It was an example of what middle-brow culture could accomplish. The magazine had brought Orthodox Jews, a group that seemed perpetually on the margins of American life, into the very center. How else to describe the America of Life magazine? For some Orthodox Jews in America, this June 13th, 1955 issue marked a turning point. So I've given you the briefest summary that comes from my forthcoming book, and that will be available for pre-order shortly, but I'd love to chat more with you about it later. Thank you.
Hello again. I'd like to say thank you to our panelists, Dr. Cooper, Dr. Levin, and Dr. Gordan, and to Dr. Gordan for organizing. It really shows the vibrancy, all three papers do, and the panel as a whole really shows the vibrancy right now of work on the American Jewish experience and the interdisciplinary nature of it. But also the newness of approach. So thank you again, and Buddy, I hope you liked it because you know you've done so much over the years to help develop and encourage the field of American Jewish Studies here at the University of Florida. Not only through programming and research, but also through the kinds of courses that we can offer that we've never been able to offer before. So thank you again for that. If you've not been to an academic panel before, there's a certain protocol that we follow, and now is the part where we take questions or comments from the audience. And what I think we will do is take 3 or 4 questions, and then we will have the panelists come up once at a time to answer. So the field is open. Please, Jack. Oh, do we have a microphone? We have a microphone that we're going to bring to you.
Well, thank you to all the panelists. It was really fascinating. And I want to address my question to Professor Levin. Sorry, not to Professor Levin, sorry. Cooper, Professor Cooper, sorry. No, the whole issue of the Metropolitan Opera is very dear to my heart since it's my second home. But one of the things that strikes me is that the connection between Jews and the Metropolitan Opera, but there's a great connection between Jews and Wagner. You know, the whole controversy about Wagner now, and German Jews love Wagner. So I'm wondering whether this is sort of generic for Jews and opera everywhere, or anyway, that's really my question.
Another? Yes, in the back. We have a microphone coming to you. It's being passed back. Here it comes.
Thank you so much. This is a question for Professor Gordan. I often think of the 1950s as a time where the myth of Judaism as part of the trilogy of American religions, like Will Herberg's Jew, Catholic, Protestant, being created. I'm curious if you could just reflect for a moment on, were the stories found in places like Life, the chicken or the egg for that misconception, and why specifically in the 1950s was there such a burgeoning interest in Judaism, and especially how this myth, which still exists today when I ask people how many Jews or the percentage they think in the United States, and I will hear 20%, 25%, 30%, and of course it's actually under 2%. So I'd be curious of your thoughts on that.
We'll take one more, and then we'll do another round. Robert?
Well, as it turns out, this is for Dr. Levin, so now we have all three. I recently saw a movie called Oppenheimer, and the Holocaust is the background of that film, and they talk about, the film deals with his flirtation with communism. I'm curious whether he ever weighed in on Zionism. I can't remember if that word was ever pronounced in the film, so I'm curious to know whether his name appears in the book.
Did you hear? Okay, who would like to go first? Samantha Cooper, you got the first question. And then Rachel.
Thank you so much for that great question. I'm so glad that the first question was about the Jewish relationship with Wagner. I think it's really post-World War II that this becomes a question at all for German Jews, but really any Jews, in terms of that relationship between Jews and Richard Wagner. Just to give a little bit of background, Wagner wrote a treatise called Judentum in der Musik. It was published in the 1850s, first anonymously, then under his name, and it sort of has these resonances across music history since the time of its publication. But the reality is that Jews of all backgrounds really loved Wagner's music, especially in the 1900s in New York. And there's actually some great documentation in the Temple Emmanuel archives of organ concerts that would be held before Shabbat services on Fridays that were often chock full of Wagner excerpts. So, this love affair comes through very strongly when you read individual and communal narratives about the Jewish relationship with opera of this time. And of course, we have the Conried narrative of his fight to get Parsifal on the Met stage, irrespective of how Wagner's widow felt about it. But at that same time, Parsifal then got translated into Yiddish and performed in the Lower East Side for and by Jewish immigrants. So again, we have these very strong ties, especially to Wagnerian repertoire. So thank you for asking about it.
I also got a great question about this post-war moment that, as the questioner referred to, is often called the Protestant Catholic Jew era in American religious history because of this famous book that the sociologist Will Herberg published in 1955 called Protestant Catholic Jew. And people often ask, how did he and everyone else who was putting forth this kind of thesis that America in the post-war era was now a Protestant Catholic Jew country, how did they sort of pull that one over, Americans? Because of course it wasn't the case that Jews were 1/3 of the US. So where did that idea come from? Why did it have so much cultural currency in this era? There are a bunch of reasons. Of course, a lot of them had to do with the war, and as my current class is learning, this post-war American desire to define ourselves in contrast to our Nazi and fascist enemies. If they, our enemies, hate Nazis, well then part of what it's going to mean to be a good liberal American is that we are opposed to anti-Semitism. We don't yet love Jews in the immediate post-war year to the extent that Americans will later. Part of what I'm saying here is that there's still some anti-Semitism going on, as we know, in the late 40s and 50s, and intermarriage is still pretty low in the 50s. That doesn't increase more until the late 60s and 70s. So these are sort of baby steps Americans are taking to turn around their old, very anti-Semitic attitudes towards Jews. But as I'm arguing and showing in my forthcoming book, popular culture, popular magazines, TV, movies are one of the ways this story is getting told, that we are now a country where Catholics and Jews are accepted alongside white Anglo-Saxon Protestants as real Americans, which had not been the case earlier. My class has just heard the famous 1941 speech that Charles Lindbergh gave in Des Moines, where he blames Jews as one of the three groups that is trying to push the U.S. into war. And they really took note, my students, of how much Lindbergh is describing Jews as a separate race, as though they're really not real Americans. That was much more typical of Americans during the first half of the 20th century than we often remember. But this change is happening in the immediate post-war era. And in terms of your question of was this popular culture and culture chicken and egg to this change, I mean, I think it's both. It's always hard to tell where is the cause and the effect. It's the engine and mirror, as I think I put in my book at one point. At times, these stories about Judaism being, one of the three main religions sort of puts that idea into some readers' minds, but it's also reflecting the changes that they're kind of seeing in the culture around them. So great question. Thank you.
We have sorry, Jeff. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. My response to the actual question is going to be short. Although I did want to say throughout Dr. Gordan's presentation, I was wondering if I needed to consider shaving, but then by the end I realized that it was okay. I also want to say there are all these sort of invisible connections with Dr. Gordan's work, including the fact that a scholar in the field, Dr. Hugh Wilford, has suggested that there's a very favorable cover story about the Egyptian President Nasser at this time, and sort of his suspicion is that there's a connection with the Eisenhower administration and Henry Luce, and so the CIA crowds as part of a public campaign at the time. In terms of the question about Oppenheimer, unfortunately I have not seen the film, and his name has never come up when I've looked at these things. That said, a name that often has come up in these sorts of debates is Einstein. And it seems like both sides of these debates, anti-Zionist, Zionists, have tried to claim him as his own, whereas he tried to, his own feelings on these issues remain pretty, seem to have obscure them, despite the fact that he was involved in some of the building universities in pre-state Israel Yishuv. He was asked to be president of Israel at one point. But I also know that he met with Arab American groups in the 30s who were trying to put together some sort of solution. So the fact that there aren't public statements by certain scientists doesn't mean that they don't have strong feelings. But if you were a prominent American Jew at the time in any field, these statements certainly could have been co-opted in lots of different ways. So that's sort of my long answer. The short answer is no.
Thank you, everyone, and now I'm actually supposed to be here. So we have a wonderful crowd. Why don't we do another round? Anyone? Yes, Johnny? And then Elliot, and then there was someone over here. Johnny's the red shirt. Wait till you get the mic there, Johnny.
This goes to the professor that did the article about the American Jews in the 1950s, striving towards middle class.
My question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Oppenheimers were executed around 1954. Rosenberg, sorry, not the Oppenheimers, no. Way off. The Rosenbergs. Thank you, I appreciate it. The Rosenbergs were executed, I believe, sometime around 1954. And this was written published in 1955. My question was, is there any correlation between the two? In other words, was the article in Life magazine in any way supposed to redeem the Jew in the eyes of the American as not old left-wing, Soviet spies? Something like that. That's my question.
Hi. Thank you. My question is for Dr. Coopers. Why didn't the Jews, the wealthy Jews, build their own opera house?
Thank you for Professor Levin. Thanks for talking about Lazarin and his association with the American Jewish Council. I noted his involvement in Baltimore Hebrew congregation where I attended, and my mother was a Hebrew school teacher. And she told me that one day the administration came to the teachers and said, "You're no longer going to be criticizing the state of Israel. Now we are all supporting the state of Israel." And I was wondering what the relationship between the Reform movement and the American Jewish Council and Zionism was around that time period.
About the question about the Rosenbergs, when I did research in the Time magazine archives, there is no mention of the Rosenbergs, but I do think it is the case that in this period before the Rosenbergs to just during the Cold War, there's an effort, especially by Jewish writers and Jewish defense organizations like the American Jewish Committee, to show that Judaism is a religion and to distance Jews and Judaism in the minds of Americans from communism. This example of the Life magazine issue was kind of special or different from some of the other examples I look at in the book because it was mostly non-Jews involved in its creation. I mentioned Kappa, who is the Jewish photographer, but otherwise, I find a lot of memos from Henry Luce, the publisher. He's the one who's really asking for a more colorful depiction of Judaism in 1955. So there's a lot of non-Jews weighing in on what they think will make for a good depiction of Judaism. And they're not talking about communism, but I think it's fair to say that that is often between the lines. If we want to present a group as acceptable in 1950s America, we have to present them as God-fearing.
Well, the short answer to your question about why Jews didn't just build their own opera house is actually that one of them did. His name was Oscar Hammerstein, and he built the Manhattan Opera House and actually also the Harlem Opera House, which the Manhattan Opera House unfortunately became such direct competition to the Met that Otto Kahn had to help buy out his contract with Manhattan, and they actually put a prohibition on him performing opera in New York and several other local cities for 10 years. And right at the end of that prohibition, he died. So he's sort of the first immediate answer that comes to mind about why didn't Jews just go build their own opera house. But the sort of additional answer to your question is that several other Jews to follow him created their own opera companies, which lasted for varying lengths of time, and some were even devoted to attempting to show opera exclusively in Yiddish translation. That one didn't last very long, but these sort of additional stories of Jews outside the Met are a separate chapter in the book that I'm working on. So I'm happy to talk to you more about that if you'd like to learn more.
Thank you for the very interesting question. So Lazarin was rabbi for decades. Then he became rabbi emeritus and actually lost in 48 or 50 his rabbi emeritus status because of his political views on Zionism, because the congregation had sort of shifted away from that. So the Reform movement, very reluctant about Zionism. You know, you look back in the 1880s, a lot of leading Reform rabbis issued a statement saying, you know, America is our Palestine. We no longer believe Jews are a nation. And some speculate this is around the time Zionism is coming into form. So a very strong belief in Jews being a religious group, because that fits into how their understanding of America, that fits into their freedom of religion, that sort of really fits in as a protected group in the US. Things start to change, and that's pretty predominant for a few decades. Things start to change in the 30s with Hitler's rise. So in 37, the movement issues a Columbus platform, really distancing themselves and moving toward it. In 42, the rabbis vote to support the building of a Jewish army and mandate Palestine, and the council forms from people who were upset with that decision. So it begins in 42 as a response to them being, as an offshoot almost of reform rabbis. A lot of the rabbis leave in a few years, but the council emerged essentially as an offshoot of the reform movement that became more of a lay organization. Most Jews changed their opinion on this in the 30s and 40s. You look at polls from late 45, there's this huge Holocaust survivor, refugee issue, and America is not letting them in. You know, there aren't great opinions of Jews amongst a lot of non-Jews in the US, or at least long, big migration. So at the very least, a lot of people who weren't card-carrying Zionists who were Jewish thought we need a Jewish state for this reason. And so there's a lot won over. Even so, the council is existing, having a significant number of members, and they're building congregations into the 50s, Reform congregations in places like Highland Park, Westchester County, actually being built around Sunday schools, because some Reform Jews are not comfortable with how religious schools are adapting sort of Israel into a central role and want a more like traditional religious school education. But they're really an offshoot and become more and more marginal as time goes on. So I think that's that. I'm going to offshoot off Dr. Gordon's question again. You know, the anti-communist stuff is also central with these groups. The American Jewish Committee, again, the mainstream group, their main figure publishes a book defending the decision to execute the Rosenbergs, which is provocative, because a lot of American Jews wanted to do everything they could to distance themselves from this. And so these conversations about Israel, Palestine, what's going on in the Cold War, is Israel like building the Cold War, what's Egypt doing with Russia, they're all sort of interrelated. So thank you.
We have time for one more round of questions. Howard has one, so we'll start with you over that side.
I don't know which of the professors want to address this. I grew up in the 50s, and the issue when I was a child growing up is, are we Jewish Americans or are we American Jews? And that was a major, major concern for those of us in elementary and middle school ages. I'm wondering what the impact of the fact of Israel's survival in 48 and the victory in Suez in the mid-50s had on the American Jewish response, as well as the American general response to the state of Israel.
That one could keep us here till Rosh Hashanah, but yeah, which is fine. But all three might want to answer actually the first part of that question. Are there a couple others? I'm trying to see hands and I don't. Well, who would like to take that one first? There were sort of two parts: the American Jews or the Jewish Americans. A brave soul comes.
This is very central, and even when we talk about American Council for Judaism trying to take away the being a Jew as a primary identity and positing religion is about this tension. And the primary divider between some of the Zionists and people who won't consider themselves Zionists is sort of that question: are we a Jew first and foremost? Is American the modifier? Is Jewish the modifier? And it's not like there's an on-off switch. These are debates that are constantly happening. 48 is a big deal. If you look at polls of American Jews in the mid-50s, when there's some border clashes that lead to the 56 war, they don't look as great for Israel as you'd think. Like not as high numbers as this is Americans generally. My feeling is more than 56 is the cultural productions talking about Jews. You're talking about the book Exodus, big blockbuster book in 56. The movie comes out with Paul Newman in 60. There are just these new images that are entering so deeply in American Jewish culture that are making Jews prouder to be affiliated with this new state of Israel. There's also in the 60s what scholars term sort of white ethnic revival, where it was like, and it was a big deal for Kennedy in 1960 to like present himself as Irish even and be Catholic, and then suddenly by the time you get to the mid-late 60s, it's okay to be proud of the hyphen. Being a Jewish, whereas before there was some pressure, especially in certain parts of this country, to really say you're an American first and downplay everything else. And that has to do with loyalty, that has to do with what it means to be an American, which is constantly changing. Now you don't want to not have, these days you don't want to not have a hyphen in a lot of crowds, but that's something that's happening in this period, and I'm sure is very interrelated to what Dr. Cooper and Dr. Gordan are doing. These subtle, maybe more subtle, sometimes cultural ways are what lead to big political identity shifts. I think a lot of times, if you don't look at politics, then you're really missing why things are happening. And so maybe if they have any follow-up or no? Okay.
It's last call. Anyone? Yes, Jack, one more. And are there any more? Yeah. Wait for the mic. You can when you get the mic.
I just want to make a little correction to what you said, if I can. It wasn't, I think, the main actor, Paul Newman, that had the impact. I think it was the name Otto Preminger for that film. When you see it come on the screen, and it was shot in 70 millimeter, I think, the power of that is enormous. And it's just something to think of, because we don't always think about the impact of cinema. And anyway, I'll shut up, but that's my thought.
Well, I would love to thank all of you for coming to this special event. When you run out of chairs at the beginning, that's a very good sign for us. It's not so great for the people in the back, but it's a very good sign for us. We also had, I think, about 30 people streaming. Which reminds me, Amanda, could you raise your hand really quickly? Amanda Bouquet is our administrator or one of our administrators at the Shorstein Center, and the table she's sitting at has some cards on it. We will have many more of those tonight, but the cards will tell you how to sign up for our mailing list so that you know about our events. Every announcement of an event has a streaming link. There's a link to our Facebook page, to our YouTube channel, and all of those sorts of things, because the Shorstein Center has a lot of events. And in fact, next week we have a very good one as well on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Jews and what's new and what's not. With that. So please pick up one of those if you're from in town, if you're from out of town. I'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Samantha Cooper, Dr. Geoffrey Levin, and of course, Dr. Rachel Gordan, who helped so much with advertising. And this is an arts and sciences space, and I'd like to thank Stephanie Baer for all of her work in getting this set up, and the cameras and the sound. They make it look easy, and I know it's not. So thank you all for coming. I'll say again, there are refreshments over there. I think if you parked in that lot, your car is fine. There's an event that we will see some of you at tonight, so don't ruin your dinner with the cookies and such. But thank you so much for coming to this special event, and we will see you soon.